Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of experimental music, moving into a band that I know I'm probably not going to have a good time with. We're checking out, once again, Xiu Xiu, this track being called Girl with Basket of Fruit. Now, I think experimental is sort of undercuts what Xiu Xiu does. But let's dive into it and see what they're bringing to the table today. There's just no way to prepare for this. Let's just dive in.
Take a break! The pressure ribs are apart! The baby duck in you is tied! Pushing out an effort to duck! It's a bad time to be a jerk! She sits on a bicycle and floats in space! She's in love with an angel! Stop laughing! When the light promise her makes her say any word, it comes out as a joke! He's not a good guest! The cutlass is a more excellent guest! Cutlass! 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 Cutlass!
There are elements in this that really feel like we're in a 1-1. If it wasn't for
Photos of her jerking into mush. It's a vagina strained without end, and her lungs fill with tears. Her lungs turn to gills. Life in one has become impossible. No path straight through Og's-Magog Bog.
the production is really strange. Some things that feel distant but shouldn't. Other things feel like they should be quieter but aren't.
The passion fruit. The cinnamon's bun. She sits on a bicycle and floats in space. She's in love with the angel, no taxi anywhere. When her pedals electric.
Like, this is a 1-1 section.
It comes out as a joke. He gurgles by the fistful from the jar in his front pants pocket. Bryan and Pepper's building up on the rings round his fingers. Her boob gets so floppy, she uses it as a fan to wave away his sickening BO. Now rubbing it off with a brick, just for his panettone. Every frog hops right up into her butthole. Every frog eats a single butthole flea on its way in. She brown box squeezes them all until froggles! And a flock of erect jigs on bat wings, peepees in her sleeping face, and pointlessly tries to fuck a blue sky. At the which execution, they all hope to be called up. They've had enough!
There's a lot of elements in here that remind me of the Death Grips track we checked out. Steroids a couple weeks ago.
Grow with basket of fruit.
And you know what's kind of crazy is I think this is one of their more approachable tracks. At least what I've been exposed to. It's certainly on the more abstract side as far as sounds and composition, even production. It's not something I think most people are going to listen to and feel comfortable with. But compared to some of the other tracks that y'all have had me listen to from them, I think this is the one that's been least abrasive for me, which is really saying something given just how, well, abrasive this track is. Um, it feels out of time constantly. There were a couple times that I pointed out, I was like, look, this feels like 1-1. And the thing is that it exists entirely on a one beat phrase. There's nothing that changes from beat to beat. If you wanted, you could hear a 4 or a 3 or some other phrase to it, but the music doesn't imply that in those moments. Um, there was a percussion thing that was going on the first time I pointed it out, and I began to say if it wasn't for, and then I trailed off because I got sidetracked on something else. But yeah, if it wasn't for that single line, because it was dictating a 4/4, or at least a 4 bar phrase within itself, everything else at that moment was 1/4 or 1/1. However, well, I guess it'd be 1/4. Yeah, not 1/1. In that the quarter note gets the beat, but we only have one beat per bar. And I bring this up specifically because it's very difficult to write one beat per bar. You have to specifically aim to create no rhythm, no pattern, no pulse. I tried it, and I think I did an okay job. It ended up sort of just as experimental as this. I'm not going to say it was a good track, but I think the concept of one was portrayed rather well, and there are some people who still felt a 4 out of it. So it's it's really difficult to achieve that, and I think that they did here, and that's why I want to bring it up. Not because it's something worth leaning into it, at least as far as I'm concerned. Maybe I'll be surprised. Somebody will be like, actually, there is this 1/4 track that's just phenomenal. You need to listen to it. I'm like, okay, that changes my mind. But as of where I stand right now in relationship to that time signature, it's for exercise purposes only. I'm not sure you could really do much with it. But I found it really interesting that it cropped up here in some form, primarily because it is formless. It's about not creating patterns, and it's kind of wild to me to listen to something like this, especially in the electronic field as this is, which is kind of defined by patterns. A lot of electronic music is background for pop or designed for dance or, you know, what is festivals and stuff, right? Where you get together and just dance in large groups for like 24 hours straight or something. Uh, Patterns are such a strong element of electronic music that this feels subversive in two ways, not just because it is music without a pattern, but it's specifically electronic music without the patterns. And so it's really difficult taking this outside of just the realm of, hey, this is new, to purpose and theme. The lack of pattern fitting, of finding phrases to grasp onto, provides a sort of free fall throughout this track. There's many sections where I felt I had no ground to stand on at all, much less a ledge to hold on to. It's a track that feels free in a constrained way. It's it's like space, right? Imagine you're just floating in space. And I know this is like a nightmare for some people, so like I guess if you have anxiety about floating without control, maybe don't envision this, but it's a freeing experience, the concept of flight, of no longer being bound to the ground. But without having a way to control it, it also feels exceptionally limiting. And I think that crossover of the two feelings is particularly what this feels like. It is sort of the freedom of weightlessness mixed with the constraints of a free fall. And so the song ends up feeling very anxious and tense throughout most of it, just from the rhythmic ideas, the lack of a pattern, and the fact that at least my brain and most human brains are pretty good at finding patterns, at least to me, adds to the anxiety. I'm looking for some sort of loop, some sort of larger idea, some pattern, and I'm not, and that is terrifying. Now, of course, this is all compounded by the music itself. The vocal delivery is wild. It shifts wildly from spoken word to singing to screaming, and you really don't know when. There's no phrasing. Again, there's no pattern here. It's not like you can expect a four-line stanza and line two is always screamed. It just seems to pop up out of nowhere whenever the vocalist wants to go in that direction. It catches me off guard often. The music adds to the anxiety and the lack of pattern finding through its pure tension. There really isn't a chord progression throughout most of this. There's just that note, and sometimes that note changes, and sometimes there's notes that go with it. Not necessarily harmonizing, but it is two notes playing at the same time. They do create harmony. And there's usually tension in that. It's usually a very unstable interval that they're working with. And I likened it at one point to Death Grip steroids. And when we checked out that track, I called it an anxiety induced fever dream or something along those lines. And this feels like the little sibling version of that. It doesn't quite go as hard and into the dissonance. It doesn't quite go as hard into the overwhelming sounds and the immense layering of abrasive textures. It doesn't quite go as hard into the length of it all. But it does a lot of the things that that track did, just to a little lesser degree. It's still a very tense nightmare, though, filled with sounds and spaces and atmospheres that make my heart race, that I don't want to be in. And I think the most terrifying aspect of it all is sort of how calm everything is production wise. If you need to, take a moment to go back and check out that Death Grip song again. And really feel how large and heavy and weighty the track is. It fills up so much space. It is a weight bearing down on your shoulders. It feels like it sonically wants to crush your head if you're wearing headphones. They push the limits of sound on that track. This achieves many of those same ideas, but done to a much lesser degree. If you looked at the volume meter over there, you'll notice that it never quite capped out. As far as I could see, even at our peak, we were about half a decibel to about 1 decibel below our maximum volume. Now, normally I might think, oh, I just messed up my levels somewhere. But using Spotify helps me because they normalize everything in software. All the songs should always be at the same level, and I set it that way to make it very easy on my life. So I can always set up the audio levels while I'm recording to the same values. There's a deliberate choice not to max out the sound here. And when you bring in some of the other aspects of the production, the vocals, sometimes just being very straightforward, there's a little bit of dread to them, a little bit of anxiety in the delivery itself. The way that the voice feels like it's just on the edge of cracking. But the volume, the enunciation, the delivery, and the accent of specific syllables feels spoken word. There's a calming element to it. There's certainly a fear somewhere, but it's not enough to make him scream all the time. Just enough to keep him on edge. The music is never overbearing or overwhelming. It's tense. It gets dense-ish at times, but nothing the listener can't handle, especially compared to denser, more anxious tracks. It is a song that always feels reserved in some capacity. Sometimes I even feel there is a veil on the track, something that makes it just a hair bit more muffled than I would expect. There's distance between me and the song that isn't present in most tracks that aim for this style. I mean, post metal, even post rock, I suppose, in as a genre, is designed to go for this wall of sound overbearing weight. I'm very used to hearing a full sound sphere for overbearing style songs, and this just never quite hits that mark. It feels just a bit too small, just a bit too distant. Some things feel just a bit too quiet. And I don't know that this is something a lot of people would pick up. Well, maybe, because I noticed first the distance, a little bit of compression, and then it made me look at the volume. So yeah, maybe some people would pick it up even if they don't have the visual aid of the volume. But the end result to me says that this is not maximum capacity. This puts me on edge. This makes me uneasy, and it could get worse in the future if they wanted to. The song obviously never hits that point, but there's always this notion that the fear and the dread are not maxed out yet. And I think that adds so much to the song. There's an implication that worse is ahead of you. As bad as this is, there could be worse. And I just find that terrifying in the context of my entire listening experience. There is something reassuring, even in the worst situations. Even when we listened to that Krallis track all those years ago, that totally wore me out, there was a bit of solace in it. That at least this is as bad as it gets. Nothing in the future is going to be more abrasive, heavier, less palatable to my ears, right? And I think a lot of songs kind of give listeners that reassurance. They show their cards early on. You know what you're getting in for, and if you don't like it, well, at least you know what's there. But this song is dread that holds its cards close, never reveals their hand. And that adds a second layer of terror to it. that I don't like. Um, a bit more of, I mean, this has all been positive in a sense. I've been praising their atmosphere building and the way that they create emotional impact through all sorts of parameters that some bands don't even really care about. But on a more positive note, I dig the instrumentation here, the sounds that they utilize, the width of tones, and I mean, this is just, electronic music 101, right? Just typical praise I get for the genre, but they tend to find really interesting sounds that it's not even like, oh, I've heard something like this, or they're just playing with envelopes and dials on a sound I've heard before. But they legitimately use tones, sounds, noises that are unique to my ear. And I think that's just part of their experimental nature. They have an experimental sound overall, and to help achieve that, they find sounds that are unique. But I always appreciate it about them, even if I don't like the music, which, I mean, make no mistake, this is not a track I'm returning to. Much like most of their work, it's just a bit too abrasive for me. I appreciate it at arm's length. It's a great artistic expression of this emotion, but I did not enjoy my time with it. But they always impress me with what they do. I'm going to take a second to hit some lyrics, and then we'll wrap this up. I mean, as usual with Xiu Xiu, their lyrics are vague, eclectic, and from the looks of some of these annotations, pulling from all sorts of weird, I guess that's not quite the word I want, just obscure sources, art, books, all sorts of stuff. And then other things people haven't figured out a connection to or don't have a connection to anything. It's just weird phrases. I mean, at one point it says she is in love with the angel of stop laughing. I mean, if that wasn't a bit odd enough, later on it says she's in love with the angel of no taxi anywhere. I mean, yes, they're taken out of context, but still, I mean, it's just, it feels like word salad at times, especially for me, who without the annotations, this would just be garbly-goop to me. But even with the annotations, there's still so many things that still seem like weird segues into ideas. And again, even knowing where they're coming from, what they're referencing, it's still a very stream of consciousness lyrical delivery. But the sinister part is always what all of this means. On the surface, it's a bunch of disconnected ideas. But people have pieced concepts together, and the puzzle that they've solved, or at least what is apparent to me, at least there's just some pieces missing, but the general picture can be seen, is that these are the recollections of a sexual abuse survivor. And showcases both the event where violence was done to them and the lasting effect it has had on them currently, the way that it still permeates into their life. With verse 4 even speaking that even in their sleep, they can't get away from the trauma. It is filled with a lot of vivid, vulgar imagery. It's it's interesting because I don't really want to go into too much detail on the channel, on YouTube. YouTube has weird rules about what can and can't be said and stuff like that. And some of these lines, as I said, are a bit explicit. So it's really weird that I would say, hey, this song's about sexual abuse. I highly suggest going and checking out the lyrics. I think if you can stomach the topic, the lyrics themselves are very interesting to read. And the way that they interlink, especially if you go to Genius and you check out the annotations and you see what all the connections are, it begins to paint a really interesting picture that I wouldn't think was possible before reading the annotations, but somehow does come together in a way that tells a story of all of this. I mean, it's a heartbreaking song. Like I don't want to sugarcoat that. If you're not in a good mental space, if you don't deal well with sexual abuse, I don't suggest checking this out. But from a purely lyrical linguistic standpoint, with callbacks and references to a bunch of other artworks, it is intriguing. There's still a lot of this that makes no sense to me, and there's other parts that I think are there just for the sheer shock value. There are certainly some very, very choice descriptions of things in here. But I think the end result, with just a little bit of extra information I have, is palpable. It creates a song that, even just on the lyrical side, has this intensity, this dread, this anxiety built into it. And of course, we got to pair this back to the music. If this is a track about dealing with the continuing trauma of being a sexual abuse survivor and feeling that pain, that anxiety, that dread, and having it permeate into every aspect of your life where not even sleep gives you a moment of peace. I think the song accurately depicts that. And this is probably not intentional at all, but I'm going to make a connection here. My feeling that this could be worse, I think lines up with this as well, because that feeling of danger around every corner means that you never feel safe, or at least our character in the story never feels safe. There is no point in the song up until it ended, and I knew, where our cap was, what everything was, but there is, up until that point, the song always had room to be larger, heavier, wider, darker, more dense, more abrasive. I had a sort of fear or anxiety that the worst was around the corner. And for a person with PTSD, that is the truth of their life. Uh, Up until a point. Hopefully, they can come to terms with it. Get help from counselors and stuff. But I mean, especially directly after the moment, when that trauma is still exceptionally effective over your experience of life, dangers around every corner. Any moment could immediately turn for the worst, and that's how I felt about a lot of this song. Again, I don't know if that's necessarily an authorial intention that could be read from it, but it certainly paralleled my experience with the track in a way I wasn't expecting. Those are my thoughts on Xiu Xiu's Girl with Basket of Fruit. Let me know what you thought of this track. Down in the comment section, give me your perspective, your opinions, whatever you want to add down there. Did you enjoy it? Is there anything you get out of it that I didn't touch on? Let me know. Above that, in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. It takes you to this menu right here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of them. We do have a special selection coming up next. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC, as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.